began in 1952 in the British colony of Kenya is one of the most researched and controversial topics in African history. Scholars alternatively classify it as a proletarian revolt, a myth devised by colonial authorities, an expression of tribalism, a civil war, a proto-nationalist assault, and, in the words of Elspeth Huxley, a yell from the swamps. The role of sexuality in the rebellion has, however, been largely ignored, a particularly odd allusion as the documentary record so plainly shows that sexuality suffused the colonial discourses prompted by the rebellion. This paper examines sexuality during the Mau Mau crisis, focusing on the Mau Mau oathings, i.e. ceremonies where Mau Mau rebels and their supporters made formal vows to support the rebellion. The sexual behaviors that reportedly accompanied oathing ceremonies became a central preoccupation of Anglo-Kenyans. I will argue that these ceremonies provided a conceptual framework that allowed white settlers to explain anti-colonial violence as a form of collective madness, rather than contend with the rebels' stated desires for land and freedom. But in order to understand this preoccupation, we need to contextualize the oathing mythologies within earlier colonial Kenyan attitudes towards African sexuality. In Kenya, African sexuality was often depicted as pure and non-deviant. This assertion might seem incongruous with the pathologizing of black sexuality in Africa and the diaspora. It's true that Anglo-Kenyans found African sexuality deeply problematic on several levels. For example, they claimed that Africans lacked sexual restraint and presented their bodies in immodest ways, and condemned practices like polygamy, the selling of girls in marriage, and female circumcision. However, these same features that marked African sexuality as religiously immoral took on positive connotations within psychiatric discourses. As Mark Eprecht explains in Heterosexual Africa, within the field of ethnopsychiatry, which was a combination of anthropology and psychiatry, which became popular in the early 20th century, African sexuality represented the natural expression of human sexual drives, uncomplicated by the guilt and neuroses that plague more advanced civilizations. Ethnopsychiatry even declared that certain deviant sexual practices, such as homosexuality, prostitution, and masturbation, were completely absent in indigenous African cultures. In the words of J.C. Carruthers, an ethnopsychiatrist and head of Kenya's Mathare Mental Hospital, although specific restraints are imposed upon the African sexual behavior by his or her community, there is no shameful mystery about sex or need for repression. African sexuality was considered exemplary, as it represented a sort of ideal natural sexual rubric uncorrupted by civilization. Psychologists continued to assert that Western advanced cultures were superior to those of primitive peoples, but they believed that understanding primitive sexuality could help them treat civilized deviants. As Eprecht explains, prominent theorists such as Marie Bonaparte and Carl Jung advocated applying their research methods to so-called primitive people as a means to gain insight into atavistic attitudes underpinning European social and sexual problems. And in fact, Marie Bonaparte was so convinced about this that she actually had herself circumcised as a way to get herself to experience the more mature vaginal orgasm. In other words, African sexuality offered a glimpse into the essential nature of human sexuality prior to psychological contamination. It was normative in the sense that it represented the perfect progression to mature, heterosexual, genital-oriented sexuality. Thus, when settlers expressed concern about African sexuality, they generally worried about the corrupting influence of Asians and Europeans upon African sexual cultures. European or Asian civilizations might degrade the sexual mores that supposedly typified African cultures. Such concerns, of course, neatly aligned with settlers' desire for strictly segregated communities in which Africans would only be allowed onto white land as squatted labor. It's true that in the 1920s there were several well-publicized cases in which African domestic servants supposedly assaulted white children. Interestingly, however, local media interpreted these assaults as the result of bad management by white housewives. Instances of sexual assault were framed as a result of differences in beliefs about appropriate adolescent sexual behavior between Africans and Europeans, rather than as evidence of fundamentally deviant African sexuality. The fault lay with the white settlers who had failed to properly manage African staff, not with African sexuality. Whites also worried about the effect of urbanization on African sexuality. In particular, they claimed that urban African women attracted by European goods were lured into prostitution to pay for various luxuries. Contact with European civilization created new desires and offered new forms of vice to fund them. In January 1945, a Mr. Beecher testified to the Legislative Council that, this is a quote, "There have been cases brought to my notice of the deliberate soliciting of Africans by European women." He claimed that Nairobi was home to a number of women, quote, "who can only be classed as nymphomaniacs, who should be inside an institution, and added to this, we've been responsible for the almost enforced degradation of African women." According to Beecher, African men were not the problem, it was hypersexual European women and their oversexed white male peers who were causing trouble. From the settler's perspective, the solution was obvious. Africans should be restricted to the reserves or allowed to work on white farms, far from the temptations of the city, farms which, not coincidentally, suffered from constant labor shortages. As shown above, ethnopsychiatric discourses that presented African sexuality as natural, guilt-free, and non-deviant permeated settler culture to a considerable extent. These European perceptions of African and Asian sexuality did not necessarily bear any resemblance to actual sexual cultures. They do, however, indicate the investment that Europeans had in the idea of Africans as sexually pure. It encouraged the strict social segregation of Africans and Europeans, even while the two groups lived in close proximity on European-owned farms and in large cities like Nairobi. In the remainder of this paper, I explore the sexual discourses that accompanied the outbreak of violent anti-colonial rebellion in 1952. The rebels, who came primarily from the Gikuyu, Embu, and Meru groups, wished to reclaim land and force out the white settlers and their government, hence their call for land and freedom. At this moment, when a significant segment of the African population clearly rejected European paternalism, the settler community marked the Mau Mau rebels as sexually deviant in order to emphasize their essentially foreign, non-African, and hence illegitimate nature. Mau Mau could not speak for the average African since their supposed sexual practices implied a level of neuroses unattainable by primitive peoples. Even a casual student of the Mau Mau rebellion will notice the overwhelming prominence of oathing rituals in colonial discourses about the revolt. What actually happened during these oathings is an extremely controversial and politically loaded question, particularly as a lot of confessions about the oathings were elicited through the use of torture. What seems clear is that members of the Mau Mau took oaths of loyalty to create solidarity among troops. These oaths resembled historical oathing practices in Gikuyu culture. As David Anderson has shown in his study, oathing was also sometimes used to intimidate civilians into provisioning the Mau Mau with food and supplies, and to prevent them from informing the police about the location and activities of Mau Mau. Although oathing practices probably varied considerably among different insurgent groups, in general it involved the consumption of goat meat and the use of goat blood in various ceremonial capacities, along with a verbal loyalty oath. Rather than making truth claims about these oaths, I'm interested in what these practices came to signify to European observers. Historian Daniel Grant has written, to the colonial eye, Mau Mau's oaths had become a multi-layered structure of ever-increasing and apparently fathomless depravity, including bestiality and cannibalism. Europeans obsessed over the oaths for two reasons. First, by emphasizing the non-normative sexual practices of Mau Mau rebels, they depicted Mau Mau as essentially non-indigenous. Second, the discourses surrounding oathings took on a pornographic character, suggesting that white audiences took pleasure in locating certain erotic taboos in these particular black bodies. There were several deviant practices that Mau Mau rebels supposedly engaged in. And again, I want to give the disclaimer that what I'm describing are European perceptions and discourses about African sexual practices, and in my own opinion, they probably did not at all resemble the actual oathings. The first and most prevalent was the consumption of materials that were supposedly dhatu, contaminating substances that would endanger life and required ritual cleansing. Within a European epistemology, the substances were highly sexual in nature. The most infamous was known as the Keberichia cocktail, a mixture of menstrual blood, sheep's blood, and semen to which urine and feces might be added. The cocktail represents a compounded transgression in which the male body is sullied by contact with female, animal, and autoerotic contamination. Sources also emphasize that the semen was most often produced through public masturbation. The consumption of sexual materials thus also necessitated deviant sexual activities, especially bestiality, masturbation, and sexual contact with inappropriate partners. The latter included women who were either too old or too young for sex, women who are menstruating, and/or prostitutes. European discourses emphasized the degree to which such practices violated traditional Kikuyu sexuality. So of course we also see that this involves a claim by Europeans to know what traditional Kikuyu sexuality was. Additionally, prostitution was supposedly entirely absent in polygamous communities, since men always had a wife available to serve their sexual needs. Mau Mau leaders were also occasionally accused of taking adolescent boys as lovers. For example, A History of the Kikuyu Guard, written during the rebellion for private circulation, identifies an adolescent in a photo of Mau Mau rebels as a catamite boy. The rhetoric surrounding oathing ceremonies also allowed whites to dismiss Mau Mau supporters as victims as a form of collective madness. Because they required the oath taker to violate his or her traditional values, the oath supposedly separated Mau Mau from other Africans and bound them together as moral outlaws. Referring to the oath as a form of psychologic warfare, a colonial pamphlet emphasized that women who took the oath emerged from the tunnel of pollution with little claim left on mankind. This is a quote. They, like their menfolk, are pawns in the game of producing a race to which no crime, no indecency is any longer offensive. Under the heading Sex Perversion, the Kenya Weekly News reported that the higher grade oaths no longer bear any resemblance to tribal custom, and explained that the oath, quote, breaks every ancient taboo, leaving only groups of Talibans, a mass of honorless thugs. Having so thoroughly violated the traditions of his or her tribe, the oath taker could never return to normal life. Instead, the oath spurred him or her to commit ever greater monstrosities in the name of the movement. Observers emphasized the oath's power to transform loyal, trusted domestic servants and farm workers into Mau Mau rebels. Contemporary papers describe Mau Mau as a disease infecting otherwise peaceful and contented Africans. Men and women forced to take an oath might engage in violent behavior that would be otherwise unimaginable. This propaganda helped settlers make sense of several highly publicized murders of Europeans by their own servants. By ascribing to the oath's magical power to corrupt otherwise loyal and contented employees, settlers could explain why, in the words of novelist Graham Greene, Jeeves had taken to the jungle. References to Mau Mau as an infectious disease also rationalized the mass arrests and detentions of thousands of Kikuyu men and some women, strict restrictions on the movement of Africans within the colony, and eventually the forced villagization, detention in concentration camps of all Kikuyu not already incarcerated. As settler O.H. Knight wrote in a local paper, this is a quote, "I have just been reading the unmentionable foulnesses of the Mau Mau oaths, and I can only say, in the words which the Jews use against St. Paul, away with such fellows from the earth, for it is not fit that they should live. We shall be fools indeed if we do not take all the steps in our power to keep them from finding hideouts in the Trans-Nzoia, which is a region of Kenya, from which to spread their loathsome perversions." Clearly, the mythologies surrounding Mau Mau oathings underrode the practical needs and policies of settlers in the colonial state. Mau Mau desired land and freedom, neither of which white settlers were eager to give to Africans. If the rebellion derived from a psychological disease, settlers need not loosen their hold on power or resources. Oathing mythologies also supported the idea that the Kikuyu needed to be isolated and carefully supervised, a necessary step if the colony was going to stop passive resistors from supplying the forest rebels with food, weapons, and ammunition, medicine, and information. The degree to which European observers reveled in the rebellion's erotics, however, cannot be accounted for with instrumental explanations. In conclusion, I want to describe this erotic economy and offer some preliminary ideas on their significance. One of the strange and sometimes even humorous features of the oathing mythologies was their framing as restricted reading. Texts describing oaths took pains to warn the reader of the appalling contents found within. The result, of course, was to make the reader all the more eager to continue. Candor magazine published the following warning, signed by the publisher. It's all in caps in the original. "It should not be read by subscribers, especially women subscribers, who lack strong nerves and tough minds. What is published here is a terrifying document, a horrifying document, an obscene document, but an official document. What follows should not be judged by the first half of it. The document becomes increasingly horrible to read. Subscribers can now burn the supplement or read on." These warnings set up a particularly pornographic dynamic in which the reader was lured in by the promise of salacious materials and then reassured that his or her interest in the documents was of a purely informative nature. Authors delighted in explaining that the details of oaths were unmentionable and then describing them in extensive detail. The tension implied by the publication of the unknowable, unsayable, and unimaginable clearly indicates the erotic importance of knowledge about Mau Mau's sexuality. Particularly in memoirs, Mau Mau rebels' bodies are eroticized with a frankness that is rather startling. In his unpublished memoir of service in the Colonial Police Force, Terence Gavigan describes a character modeled after Mau Mau leader M.M. Kariuki as having, again this is a quote, "the basalt column of a powerful neck, full clean-cut sensual lips, and a splendid neck which flowed through muscular sloping shoulders and a thick python waist into powerful jutting thighs and buttocks thrusting against worn cotton trousers." Forest rebels were frequently described as graceful, athletic, in tune with certain rugged masculinity that their white pursuers struggled to emulate. At times, Mau Mau took on superhuman characteristics, as when memoirist Ian Henderson claims that they could run long distances on their toes like ballet dancers without leaving tracks. This adulation / exoticization / eroticization of the male Mau Mau body found its most extreme form in the white pseudo-gangsters, Europeans who disguised themselves as Mau Mau and attempted to infiltrate groups of forest rebels. Although I don't have enough room to fully discuss the fascinating and bizarre case of the pseudo-gangsters here, it seems to say a great deal about the erotic power of Mau Mau discourses that men were not satisfied merely to read about these bodies and their activities, they desired to inhabit them. Why did this colonial rebellion take on such powerful and unique erotic power in European minds? One possibility is that it reflected a desire for expert knowledge about the African mind. In a moment of instability when colonial mastery was threatened, knowing the other, in all of its senses, might have taken on increased importance. Also, eroticizing Mau Mau might have served to reassure colonial settlers that good Gikuyu could be distinguished from bad Gikuyu. Mau Mau rebels were racialized as non-African through these sexual discourses, particularly when one takes into account the frequent assertions that Mau Mau was actually a communist plot devised by the Soviets. The idea of sexual chaos or bacchanalia might also have been a familiar trope for settlers struggling to narrate an unpredictable and unanticipated reversal of the status quo. What is certain is that sexuality influenced colonial attitudes in Kenya much more than has been previously recognized. We need to examine it in order to understand the racialization of whites, Africans, and Asians in Kenya, and any political history of Kenya is incomplete without an analysis of race and sexuality.